Hello and welcome to the Advanced Placement World History Podcast. This is episode 20, The Atlantic Revolutions and Their Echoes. As you listen to this podcast, make sure you have your notes frame printed off and that you're ready to take notes. In Unit 3, we looked at intellectual and cultural transformations in Europe. This started with the Renaissance, then the Reformation came, the Scientific Revolution, finally the Enlightenment. So, when we look at these political revolutions that occurred in the Atlantic world between 1750 and 1850, we want to keep that historical context in mind, the Enlightenment and Scientific Revolution. So it's important to understand that the Enlightenment wasn't one event. It's more of a broad movement with ideas that spread throughout the Atlantic world over a period of time. Enlightenment thinkers were influenced by the Scientific Revolution. They wanted to apply the methods and questions of the Scientific Revolution to the study of human society. Enlightenment thinkers were operating under the assumption that if scientists could understand the laws of nature through using the scientific method, there is probably a way that we can understand the laws of human nature also by bringing that scientific approach. So bringing that scientific approach to the study of a society and the idea that society needed to be guided by science, not guided by religion. Among the important Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke in 1690 argued that the purpose of a government was to protect life, liberty, and property. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argues in The Social Contract that the will of the people is sacred and the rule of kings is dependent on the will of the people, so their authority derives from the will of the people. But it's also important to understand that the Enlightenment wasn't one totally uniform movement. There were a lot of disagreements within the Enlightenment movement. Thinkers ranged from moderate to radical. Moderates wanted to bring about slow social change, but at the same time, a lot wanted to preserve the role of the monarchy and nobles in society. Radicals, on the other hand, wanted to really eliminate the existing social structure that gave certain people privileges based on their birth. It would be wrong to suggest that all European monarchs tried to suppress the Enlightenment. Some monarchs actually promoted the spreading of new ideas. Examples of this include Charles III of Spain, Catherine the Great of Russia, Frederick the Great of Prussia. Typically, monarchs were more than willing to embrace new ideas that would lead to economic progress in their kingdoms, but usually tried to suppress ideas that challenged the rights of kings and queens or challenged religious authority. So really, this podcast is about three revolutions: the American, the French, and the Haitian. These revolutions were inspired by Enlightenment ideas. This podcast also look at the impact of these revolutions. Each of these revolutions is distinct from each other, but there's some common threads that run through all three, and one of the benefits of a world history approach is that you can see these revolutions not as isolated events, but rather as part of a larger global process. So in order to understand the American Revolution, we want to look at what the American colonies were like before the Revolution. The Spanish and the Portuguese, we know, were the first to arrive in America, and they took over what the European powers saw as being the best land in America. The British and the French would take most of North America, but they really felt that it was the dregs of the continent, the least desirable land. And maybe it was partly because of this attitude in the 16 and 1700s. Great Britain tended to not really pay enough attention to what was happening in British America. The North American colonies were not really the major priority. Britain was more interested in their plantation colonies in the Caribbean because these generated a lot of wealth for Britain. And plus, on top of that, Britain was really involved in war after war in the 16 and 1700s. So, during this period, life was actually pretty decent for colonists in the 13 colonies. Britain provided the colonies with military protection. The colonies had access to British markets, and in terms of government, Britain was really hands-off to their approach. The 13 colonies had a lot of autonomy to rule themselves. And these colonies were really radically different than anything that existed in Europe because there was no landed nobility, no nobles, and there wasn't one powerful church. So there was this great deal of independence that emerged in the colonies and sort of this spirit of self-rule, of autonomy. What really sparked the American Revolution was when Great Britain decided that they were going to take away some of this self rule and begin to rule the colonies with a more hands on approach. So, now the actual revolution. One of the major military conflicts of the mid 1700s was the Seven Years' War, and this was a war that was fought in both Europe and the European colonies, such as the Americas. Today, Americans know this as the French Indian War. If you remember from Canadian history last year, part of this war included the British conquest of New France after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. And anyways, the Seven Years' War was very expensive for Great Britain, and basically what happens is Britain decides that they're going to have the colonists in America pay for the overseas cost through taxation. From Britain's perspective, this was fair. They were racking up this debt. One of the reasons was because they were fighting overseas, protecting the colony. Therefore, they're going to have their overseas colonists pay for it. So the monarchy imposed new taxes and tariffs on the colonists, and Britain really started acting more like an imperial power. Now, from the perspective of the colonists, this was an injustice. Not only were they losing some of their independence, but they were not even going to be given fair representation in the British Parliament. So, the rallying cry of the colonists, you might be familiar with, became no taxation without representation. And the colonists were armed with the ideas of the Enlightenment, popular sovereignty, natural rights, consent of the governed. And the colonists went ahead and signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, basically declaring themselves a sovereign nation. They went to war with Great Britain, and this was a war that the American colonists would eventually win. And one of the main reasons they were able to win the war is because France was fighting on their side. So typically, we associate the term revolution with a radical change of some kind. People discontented over the existing order and wanting to establish a new system. But this isn't what the American Revolution was all about at all. Instead, it was really more of a conservative movement. And when I say conservative, I mean that it was done with the intention of preserving the existing order, to preserve liberties that already existed in the colonies, as opposed to creating new ones. Most revolutions are caused from social tensions within a society. In the case of the American Revolution, it was an outside force that caused the revolution. It was a quite sudden effort by the British government to strengthen its control over the colonies and to extract revenue from them. So this is very different from the French Revolution.